My name is Luke Mercer, and the single smartest decision I ever made in my entire life was listening to my best friend when he told me to lie. Not a small lie, not a white lie, a massive, cold, calculated lie about $20 million. And I want to be very clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not a dishonest person. I have never in my life gone out of my way to deceive the people I love. But what I discovered after that lie was told what crawled out of the shadows the moment my family believed the money was gone changed every single thing I thought I knew about the people I trusted most in this world. Here's what you need to understand before I go any further. My father passed away 14 months before I sold that property. He spent 31 years building something real from nothing, a large piece of land outside the city that he bought when he had almost nothing in his bank account. When people told him he was wasting his time, when the neighborhood thought he was chasing a dream that would never pay off, he poured his life into it. And when he died, he left it to me. Not to my mother, not to my stepfather, not to my brother, to me. Specifically, deliberately, to me. I didn't fully understand why at the time. I thought maybe it was just because I was the oldest. Maybe it was because I had spent more time with him toward the end. But I understand now. He knew something I didn't. He saw something in the people around me that I was too close to see myself. And the way he chose to leave that property, the way he put my name alone on that document, was the last act of protection he could give me from the grave. I just didn't realize it until the day I watched my entire family transform into complete strangers the moment they believed the money had vanished. Let me take you back to the beginning of all of this, because if I just tell you the ending, you won't feel the weight of what happened. You won't understand how deeply these people were embedded in my life, how much I genuinely loved them, and why the truth, when it finally came out, hit like the ground after a long fall. My father, Gerald Mercer, was the kind of man you don't find often anymore. He was quiet in public, but enormous in a room the moment he spoke. He had this way of making every person he talked to feel like the most important person in the world. He worked in construction most of his life, started as a laborer at 19, worked his way into project management by his 30s, and somewhere in between, with years of savings and fierce discipline, he bought that land. It sat on the edge of a growing town, about 40 acres of open land, and for most of my childhood it didn't look like much. He'd take me out there on weekends sometimes, just the two of us, and we'd walk the property while he told me his plans. He talked about what he wanted to build there someday. A community center, maybe residential units. He had these big ideas, and the way he described them made you feel like you were already standing inside them. He never got to build those things. Life got in the way, and then his health got in the way, and eventually the land just sat there, year after year, holding his unbuilt dreams. When he died, the weight of that land came down on my shoulders entirely. Property taxes alone were brutal. Maintenance wasn't cheap. And every time I drove out there, I felt this complicated grief sitting in my chest that I couldn't shake. It was like standing inside a memory that hadn't finished yet. After more than a year of back-and-forth conversations with myself, I made the decision to sell. The process took almost 8 months. Lawyers, investors, negotiations that fell apart and started over, meetings that ran 4 hours and ended with nothing signed. It was exhausting in a way that people who haven't been through a major real estate transaction can't quite understand. You're not just selling land. You're managing legal exposure, financial timelines, relational pressures, and your own grief all at the same time. My family was present through all of it. That's important for you to understand. They weren't distant during this process. They were close. Unusually close, looking back. My mother, Diane, called me almost every other day. She had remarried several years after my father passed, a man named Carl, who had been around long enough that I treated him like family, even though I knew my father and he were different kinds of men entirely. Carl was always generous with advice, always had an opinion about what I should do with the property, who I should talk to, what kind of offer was worth accepting. I appreciated it at the time. I thought it was genuine investment in my well-being. My younger brother, Travis, had started checking in more than usual too. Travis and I had always had a decent relationship, but never an extremely close one. He was 5 years younger than me, still figuring out his professional life, and I had always been the one who seemed to have things together. During the sale process, he started texting me regularly. He'd ask how things were going. He'd occasionally suggest we get lunch. It felt good, honestly, like the stress of the sale was bringing us closer. My aunt on my mother's side, my cousin Marcus, Even some family friends who I hadn't heard from in years. They all seemed to be circling back into my life right around the time the sale was in its final stages. I noticed it, but I didn't think about it the right way. I told myself this is what family does. When something big is happening, they show up. And then there was my best friend, Dominic. Dominic and I had known each other since we were 18 years old. We met during orientation week at university and became close within the first semester in the way that only happens when you're young and figuring out who you are, and you find someone who seems to be asking the same questions. We were very different people in a lot of ways. He was more calculated, more observant, slower to trust, but those differences were exactly why our friendship worked. He balanced me. I was optimistic by nature. He was careful. I trusted quickly. He took his time. When my father was sick in his final months, Dominic drove me to the hospital in the middle of the night more than once without being asked. When the funeral happened, he stood beside me the entire day and barely said a word, because he understood that what I needed that day wasn't conversation. When the sale process started, he helped me understand documents, pushed back when lawyers used language that seemed vague, and stayed on the phone with me during long drives back from negotiations when I was too tired to think straight. He was, without question, the most reliable person in my life. So when he called me on the afternoon the sale finally closed, I picked up immediately. I was still in the parking structure of the building where I had just signed the final papers. My hands were still slightly shaky from the adrenaline of it. $20 million. It was done. I told him the news the moment he answered. There was a pause. Then he said, in that measured voice of his, "Luke, that's real money. Your father would be proud of you." We talked for a few minutes about the process, the final meeting, the relief of it being over. And then his voice shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way it shifts when he's about to say something he's been thinking about for a long time. He told me he needed to ask me something, and he needed me to hear it without reacting immediately. I told him to go ahead. He said, "When your family asks about the sale, and they will ask tonight, probably, I need you to tell them the bank took the property. Tell them you had significant debts attached to it, and that after the forced sale and all the fees were cleared, you walked away with almost nothing." I actually laughed. Not a real laugh. More of a reflex laugh, the kind you produce when something hits you as so absurd that your brain reaches for humor before logic. I told him that was a strange joke. He told me it wasn't a joke. I stopped laughing immediately. I asked him what he was talking about. Why would I tell my family that? Why would I lie to the people who had been supporting me through this entire process? My mother had called me practically every week. My brother had been checking in. Carl had been giving me advice for months. These people cared about me. Why would I do something like that? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Luke, I need you to trust me. I'm not going to explain everything right now, but I'm asking you to do this. And I'm asking you because I've never asked you for something like this before." He was right about that. In 15 years of friendship, Dominic had never once asked me to do something that felt wrong or uncomfortable. He was the opposite kind of friend, the kind who told you hard truths when you didn't want to hear them, not the kind who manipulated you into doing things. I sat in that parking structure for 10 minutes after we hung up, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. Something about his tone had settled into me. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't dramatic. He was calm in the specific way he got calm when he was certain about something. I had seen that calmness before, and I had learned over the years that when Dominic was that calm about something, he was usually right. I texted him one word, "Fine." He replied 2 seconds later, "Thank you." That evening, I drove to my mother and Carl's house for dinner. It was a Thursday, and we had been doing family dinners fairly regularly since my father passed, something my mother had started as a way to keep everyone connected. When I pulled up, I could see lights on in the kitchen and a few cars already parked outside. Marcus's car was there. My aunt's car was there. Even Travis's car, which I hadn't expected. I walked inside and was immediately met with warm energy. My mother hugged me at the door. Carl was already pouring drinks. Travis came over and clapped me on the shoulder and asked with a big smile how I was feeling. The room was buzzing in a way I can only describe as anticipatory, like everyone was waiting for an announcement. And I understood in that moment that they had all gathered here tonight specifically for this. They knew the sale was closing today. They had coordinated around it. This wasn't a coincidence. I stood there in the middle of that room with $20 million sitting in an account with my name on it, and I looked at all these people who loved me, and I said the words Dominic had asked me to say. I told them there had been complications. I told them that there had been debts tied to the property that I hadn't fully understood, old liens, deferred taxes, legal fees that had accumulated. I told them the bank had forced the resolution of those debts through the sale, and I told them that after everything was settled, there was almost nothing left. The room went quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when the temperature drops 10 degrees without warning. My mother's smile disappeared. Not slowly, quickly, like someone had switched it off. Carl set down the glass he had been holding and asked me to repeat what I had just said. I repeated it. Almost nothing left. Travis's expression did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't become sad. It didn't become sympathetic. It became flat. Closed. Like a door shutting. Marcus looked at his phone. My aunt said she had forgotten something and needed to make a call. Within 20 minutes, the dinner that had been set up as a celebration had essentially dissolved. People found reasons to leave. Conversations that had been warm became short. The food on the table sat mostly uneaten. I drove home that night telling myself they were just disappointed on my behalf. That was the only explanation that made sense to me. They cared about me, and they were sad that the sale hadn't gone the way they had hoped. That was all. I held on to that explanation for almost 3 weeks. The silence came first. My mother, who had been calling me every few days for months, stopped calling entirely. When I called her, the conversations were short and slightly formal, like talking to someone you know professionally but not personally. Carl, who had been full of advice and energy during the sale process, barely acknowledged me when I saw him. Travis, who had been texting me regularly, went completely quiet. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself people got busy. I told myself grief did strange things to family dynamics, and maybe everyone just needed space. But then the comments started. It began with small things. My aunt mentioned casually at a brief family gathering that I should really think about getting a more stable income source. Travis made a joke, delivered with a smile, but landing with weight, about how it was probably time for me to stop relying on inheritance and build something on my own. Carl said, over dinner one evening, that it was a shame my father's work hadn't been better protected. He said it while looking directly at me, like the failure was mine, like I had done something wrong. My mother sat through that dinner without saying a word in my defense. That silence sat inside me like a stone. The strangest part was that none of these people had ever spoken to me this way before. In all the years I had known them, I had been the responsible one, the one who handled things, the one they pointed to as an example. And now, in the span of a few weeks, I had become the cautionary tale. About a month after the dinner where I delivered the news, my mother asked me to come over on a Sunday afternoon. She said Carl wanted to talk about something. The message was brief and the tone of it sat wrong with me, but I went. When I arrived, the 3 of them were in the living room, my mother, Carl, and Travis. They were sitting in a way that felt arranged, like they had been waiting. Carl started talking immediately. He said they had been discussing the situation and were concerned. He said that he and my mother couldn't allow the house to become a place where people came to depend on them financially. I told him I wasn't depending on them. I had my own place, my own income. I had never once asked them for money. He talked over me as if I hadn't spoken. Then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He looked at me and said, "This family doesn't carry dead weight." My mother looked at the floor. I turned to her and asked her directly if she had anything to say. She looked up briefly, and what I saw in her face wasn't grief or discomfort. It was agreement. Passive, quiet agreement with every word that had just been said to me. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, I hear you." And I walked out of the house. I sat in my car in their driveway for 4 minutes. Then I drove to Dominic's apartment and knocked on his door. When he opened it and saw my face, he didn't say anything clever or told you so. He just stepped aside and let me in. I sat on his couch and stared at the wall for a while before I started talking. When I told him what Carl had said, Dominic closed his eyes for a moment like someone absorbing a blow he had already been bracing for. Then he told me what he had heard. About 5 weeks before my sale closed, Dominic had been at a small gathering at my mother's house. It was a casual weekend thing, not a formal dinner, just people stopping by. At some point in the evening, he had stepped outside to take a phone call, and when he was coming back in through the side door, he overheard Carl and Travis talking in the hallway. He stopped because he heard my name. What he heard, and he was careful to describe it exactly as it had happened, without embellishment, was a conversation between Carl and Travis about the money from the property sale. They were discussing it as though it was already partially theirs. Carl was talking about a business idea he had been sitting on for years and how Luke's situation could be the funding mechanism for finally getting it off the ground. Travis was talking about a debt he needed to clear and how the timing of the sale was, in his words, honestly perfect. They weren't talking about asking me. They were talking about the money as though access to it was already a given. Dominic stood in that hallway for 2 full minutes listening before he walked away. He didn't say anything that night. He spent the next several weeks deciding what to do. He didn't tell me because he knew. He knew me. That I would have pushed back immediately. That I would have confronted someone. That I would have been defensive of my family against his accusation because that is exactly who I am. He understood that the only way I would truly see it was if they showed me themselves. And they had. I sat with that information for a long time in the quiet of his apartment. The grief I had been carrying since the sale, the confusion about why everyone seemed to pull away, the self-doubt about whether I had somehow failed them. All of it reorganized itself into something completely different. I hadn't failed them. They had failed me. And the reason it hurt so much was precisely because I had loved them so genuinely and so completely. And that love had made me unable to see the transaction they had been running in the background of our relationship. Dominic said something that night that I've thought about many times since. He said, "The people who are only there for the money don't disappear when the money is gone. They make you feel like you're the reason they left." That was exactly what had happened. They hadn't just pulled away. They had made it my fault. 3 weeks later, our family held a memorial gathering for my father at a local community space he had frequented. It was something my mother organized every year. A small event with people who had known him, neighbors from the old neighborhood, a few of his former work colleagues, people from the church he had attended. It was one of the few family traditions I still genuinely valued. I showed up and kept a low profile for most of the evening. I talked to a few of my father's old friends. I listened to the short speeches about what kind of man he was. And I felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to peace. Because in this room, my father was being remembered accurately. People who actually knew him were talking about who he actually was. Then Carl stood up and gave a speech. It was a good speech on the surface. He talked about legacy and hard work and what it meant to build something real. He talked about my father with a warmth that sounded genuine. And at the end, he said that the best way to honor Gerald Mercer's memory was to carry his values forward. I sat there listening to that, and I felt something solidify inside me. When Carl finished and sat down, I stood up. My mother looked surprised. Carl looked slightly irritated. I hadn't been on any program for the evening. But I stood up, and I said I had something I needed to say. The room gave me its attention. I said that I had been carrying something for a few weeks, and that tonight, in a room full of people who genuinely loved and knew my father, felt like the right time to set it down. I told them the truth. I told them that the sale had completed, that the bank had taken nothing, that there had been no debts, no liens, no forced settlement, that the property my father had spent 31 years building had sold for $20 million, and that every cent of it had gone directly to me, exactly as he had intended when he put my name alone on that document. The room was completely silent. I looked at my mother. Her face had gone pale. Carl's jaw had tightened in a way that told me he was working very hard to stay composed. Travis looked at the floor. My aunt stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I told them that the most revealing thing about the past few weeks was not the lie. It was their reaction to it. That the moment they believed the money was gone, so was their warmth, their calls, their presence, their kindness. That they had spent months being close to me not because they loved me, but because they were positioning themselves near something they wanted. I told them that my father had known what he was doing when he left that property to me alone. And then I said one more thing. I told them that I hoped, someday, they would find something in their lives worth loving that had nothing to do with what it could give them. Then I walked out. The fallout was immediate and then, strangely, quiet. Carl called me 3 times that night. I didn't answer. Travis sent a long message that started with, "You need to understand the context." I read the first 2 sentences and put my phone down. My mother sent a shorter message that said she hoped I would come back and talk when I was less emotional. I sat with that one for a while, because it was precisely the kind of reframing that her relationship with Carl had trained her to do. Make my clarity look like an overreaction. I blocked all of them that night. Not out of anger. Out of self-respect. Dominic and I talked for a long time over the following days. I had a lot to process, and part of what I needed to process was a kind of grief that is different from the grief of losing someone to death. This was the grief of losing people who were still alive, but who had turned out to be something entirely different from what I had believed. It's a disorienting kind of loss because there's no clean moment of ending, no funeral, no ceremony. You just slowly rearrange your understanding of years of memories until you see them through the correct lens. Some of those memories hurt more once I understood them properly. The calls from my mother during the sale, I saw them now as check-ins on the timeline, not expressions of care. Carl's advice about what offers to accept, I understood now that he had opinions about my business because he thought it would eventually become his business. Travis's sudden warmth, it was proximity to a windfall. And some memories became more precious. Every time my father had stayed quiet about certain family dynamics. Every time he had pulled me aside and said, specifically and clearly, that I needed to learn to trust my own judgment. Every time he had talked to me about that property as something that was specifically mine, not ours, not the family's, mine. He had seen it. He had understood what I would eventually need to understand. And the only way he could protect me from it was to put my name on that document and hope I would figure out the rest. I like to believe he also knew I would find my way to Dominic on that particular couch, on that particular night, and that Dominic would be the one to hold the line with me when I wasn't able to hold it for myself. I want to talk directly to you for a moment, because I think there's something in this story that goes beyond my family and my situation. There is a specific kind of person in almost every family, and I want you to hear this clearly, who mistakes proximity for entitlement. They are close to you not because they love you in the way you love them, but because they have identified you as a source. Sometimes that source is money. Sometimes it's status. Sometimes it's just stability, having someone they can lean on who they know will always be there. And they are often very good at performing love. They remember your birthday. They show up at important moments. They say the right things. But the performance has a condition attached to it, even if no one ever says the condition out loud. The condition is that you continue to provide whatever it is they are close to you for. The cruelest version of this is when you grow up inside of it. When the people doing this are your family, the people who were supposed to love you simply because you exist. Because then their performance doesn't just fool you. It becomes the foundation of your identity. You grow up believing you are loved. You grow up feeling secure. And then something happens that removes the thing they were actually there for, and in the silence that follows, you see the architecture of it all with terrible clarity. What saved me, what I want you to hear, was a friendship that had absolutely nothing to gain from my success. Dominic didn't benefit from that property. He had no claim to it. He had no financial interest in it. He couldn't gain anything by asking me to lie, and he couldn't lose anything by staying quiet. The only reason he did what he did was because he had been paying attention to the people around me for years, and he saw something I couldn't see because I was too close to it. And when the moment came, he made a choice that protected me at the cost of making himself look strange and unexplained for several weeks. That is what real loyalty looks like. It doesn't always feel warm in the moment. Sometimes it asks you to do something uncomfortable. Sometimes it tells you something you don't want to hear. Sometimes it is the friend who stays quiet in a loud room and sees clearly what everyone performing emotion has missed. If you have someone like that in your life, hold on to them with everything you have. They are rarer than $20 million. It has now been almost a year since that evening at the memorial. I have not spoken to Carl, Travis, or my aunt since. My mother reached out twice in the months that followed. Once through a letter that was mostly about how hurt she was, and once through a mutual family friend who suggested I was being too hard on everyone. I didn't respond to either. I am not angry at my mother. That's the honest truth. What I feel toward her is something sadder than anger, a kind of compassionate distance, the way you might feel towards someone you watched make a choice you couldn't stop them from making. She chose a life with Carl that required her to slowly rearrange her relationship with truth, and by the time that night came, she had been doing it for so long that she couldn't see it anymore. I hope she's okay. I genuinely do. But I also know that my well-being cannot be contingent on her finding clarity that she may never find. The money, for what it's worth, is being put to use in ways that would make my father proud. I have invested a portion of it into a small development project, something real, something physical, something you can stand inside. On the land adjacent to the original property, there is now the beginning of a community space. It won't be finished for another 2 years. But when it is, there will be a small plaque near the entrance with my father's name on it. That was always what the land was supposed to become. He just needed me to be the one to finish what he started. I think about him often. I think about those walks across the property when I was young, when he would describe his plans, and I would try to picture everything he was describing. I understand now that he was doing more than painting a vision of the future. He was teaching me to see past what was directly in front of me. He was teaching me to look at a piece of empty land and see what it could become. It turns out that skill applies to more than real estate. If you've made it to the end of this, I want you to ask yourself one honest question. Think about the people who are closest to you right now. Think about the ones who are most present, most warm, most invested in your success. And then ask yourself, if everything changed tomorrow, if the money was gone, if the status was gone, if the thing they benefit from disappeared overnight, who would still be there? Not who do you hope would still be there. Who actually would? That answer will tell you more about your real life than almost anything else. My father spent 31 years building something on that land. What he actually left me wasn't the property. It wasn't the $20 million. It was the lesson that came after, the one I had to live through to understand. He taught me what real loyalty looks like by arranging, from beyond the grave, the clearest possible demonstration of what it doesn't. I'm Luke Mercer, and I will never stop being grateful for the most important lie I ever told.